Welcome. I wonder how early this morning you prayed your first prayer. Well, in Psalm 63, David declares to God, "Early will I seek thee." And when we look at the Hebrew for those words, we discover how early he's referring to. It refers to the first light of dawn, the first task of the day. Yet as we proceed with the psalm, we'll see that David had already begun his prayers long before that. My name is Keith Simons. I'm a Bible teacher from England, and I present these talks on how to understand the King James Bible as we look at the book of Psalms. Today we're going to be looking verse by verse and word by word through Psalm 63. And we begin with the ancient heading of that psalm. It says, "A psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah." Wilderness, the dry area, the desert area. It's not complete desert, like you might see a desert where there's just sand. We're talking about a dry area of land where a few bushes grow and where there's not very much water. That's a wilderness. The word wilderness means a wild place. And yet, in this wilderness, David prayed and he sought God, and he wrote, it seems, this psalm. What was he doing in a wilderness? Well, the answer to that is that before David became king, the king was King Saul, and Saul turned against David in bitter hatred and jealousy of David. And Saul organised an army of men to hunt down David and to try to kill him. So this was a truly desperate situation in David's life, a situation where David did not turn to men for help, he turned to God. And so we see him in verse 1, and he's praying. He prays, "O God, thou art my God, early will I seek thee." So he begins with prayer to God, to the strong and mighty one, to the ruler of heaven and earth. But it's not enough for David that he should be praying to this great God. No, he wants to make a declaration. This is the God who David himself serves. He says, "Thou art my God. I've chosen you as the only one who deserves my worship and praise, the only one who I respect truly as God. It's to you I turn. It's to you I trust. It's you for whom I seek." And then that line which we began with, "Early will I seek thee." To seek early. It's describing the first task of the day. If you've got something really important to do, you don't waste time leaving it off until later on in the day. No, you make it your first priority, the first thing of importance. And for David, stuck there in the wilderness, in this desperate situation, what is his first priority? Is it to find water? To get food? To move to a place of safety? No, David says. His first priority is to meet with God. Early will I seek thee. Then David prays about his desperate situation. He says, "My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is." Oh, David is thirsty, but not so much for water. He's thirsty for God. He needs God to be working powerfully in his life. And it's not merely his body that is thirsty, it's his soul. He says, my soul, my inner life thirsts for you, God. He's saying deep inside, I've got this desire and this need to meet with you, God. I've got deep inside this desire for you, and nothing will satisfy me other than you, the living God. But it's not, as we've said, just David's soul, his inner self, that thirsts for God. It's his body too. His body needs God more than it needs water to drink, more than it needs food. My flesh, that means his body, longeth for thee. To long is to desire. My body desires you. Although my body feels desperate because of lack of water, it feels all the more desperate to be far and far away from God in this dry and thirsty land where no water is. So what is David thirsting after? What is David longing for? He answers that question in verse 2. To see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen thee in the sanctuary, the holy place. In David's day, that meant the tabernacle, the sacred house of God, where the priests would lead worship and before which animals were offered as sacrifices, gifts to God, so that God made it possible for people to pray to him. And David had an experience of God in that holy place. He didn't go inside the tabernacle that was just for the priests. It was in the courts or the courtyards that surrounded the tabernacle that David had that experience of God, that David prayed to God, and seeing the smoke from those sacrifices rising into heaven, David knew that God was hearing his prayer. But now David had been taken away from that place. He was far from it, in this desperate, dry, thirsty land. There he was. Could he still pray there? Could he pray when he had been separated from the place of worship? Maybe during the time of the COVID epidemic, your church was closed for prayer to avoid the infection spreading. Could you still pray at home? And could you pray if you were driven far from your home into a desert place, into a wilderness? What would you desire then? Would you still desire God? David desired God. He desired God more than anything else. Just as he had seen God in the sanctuary, in the holy place, so now in this dry and thirsty land where no water is, he prayed that he might see thy power and thy glory. He wanted to see the power, the strength of God. He wanted to see God's glory, his beauty, his majesty. And David desired that very much. So why did he desire it? Verse 3, because thy loving kindness is better than life. My lips shall praise thee. Thy loving kindness is better than life. Loving kindness, God's kindness, his mercy. It's part of God's character to show that loving kindness. And David desired God's loving kindness more than anything else. David isn't really comparing here. It looks, I know, at first glance as if he's saying loving kindness is better than life. Well, I tell you that when God shows his loving kindness to a person, he gives that person salvation, rescue and safety, and so he gives that person life. It's not a choice between loving kindness and life. So what's happening here? The Hebrew has the plural word for life. It says, because thy loving kindness is better than lives. And that seems to mean that David is saying that God's loving kindness is better than all these different conditions of life in which people live. People may look at a wealthy man and say, that's the real life. Or someone who's popular and say, that person really lives and knows how to live. Or someone who's got every kind of luxury. They say, that's the life for you. David is saying, God's loving kindness, God's mercy is better than anything that people call life. That is the sort of loving kindness that I need, the kindness of God in my life. And here in the wilderness, people would say, I've got no life. I'm struggling even to get the food and the water I need each day. I've got an enemy hunting after me with an army and trying to kill me. And yet I know the loving kindness of God, and it's better than the lives of the wealthy person and of the famous person and of the luxurious person. Therefore, with my lips, I praise the living God. I give him thanks. I declare how great God is. Verse 4, thus will I bless thee while I live. Oh, my whole life must be given, whether long or short, to the praise of my wonderful God. I want to honour him. I want to do what he wants. I want to declare how good he is. I will lift up my hands in thy name. It's the ancient form of prayer, to lift your hands up towards heaven, as if reaching out to God for his help, as if giving yourself totally to God. He lifts up his hands in God's name. He lifts up his hands towards God. It is God who he depends upon. Verse 5. And verse 5, David said earlier in this psalm how thirsty he is, how desperate he is. But now he declares he's going to be satisfied. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise thee with joyful lips. Verse 6. When I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches. Okay, David in verse 1 said, early will I seek thee, and he meant at dawn, at the first light of day. And then he realises, because he's been thinking this prayer through the night, he realises he doesn't have to wait till early, the first light of day, because God is already there to hear his prayer. And David thought in verse 1 that to be satisfied, he had to have his needs provided. He was in a dry and thirsty land where no water is. But now he realises that seeing he's not thirsting so much for water as for God, that he can be satisfied even in this desperate situation. Okay, what does verse 5 say? My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness. In verse 1, his soul was thirsting. But in verse 5, it's satisfied. David has everything he needs. Not necessarily for his body yet, but for his soul, his inner life. Yes, it has everything that he needs. In fact, more than he needs. Luxuries, marrow and fatness. The English word marrow means when you break apart a bone, the soft material in the centre. It's easy to digest food. And so is the fat of an animal. But the Hebrew, we shouldn't dwell too much on the English meaning of the word marrow, because the Hebrew here simply means, my soul shall be satisfied as with fat and fatness. David here really is emphasising fat, the fat of animals, what was considered to be the greatest luxury in Bible times. This luxury would be David's. David's soul inside himself is fully satisfied, as much as the richest food could satisfy anyone's body. David has everything he needs because, verse 6, he is remembering God. He is meditating on God. And if David's soul is satisfied, then his mouth is going to praise God with joyful lips. He's going to joyfully sing praise to God, because when his soul is satisfied, his whole body is filled with joy at God's goodness. This happens when David, verse 6, when I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches. Upon my bed. I don't suppose David had a very good bed in the wilderness. People often used to just simply sleep on a mat, or when they didn't have a mat to lie on, well then, like Jacob when he was fleeing from Esau, they would just lie on the ground with a stone maybe as a pillow. Yet that was their bed, and even in that situation they could remember God. They could think upon God. And just as God gave to Jacob a vision late at night, so David, there awake in this dry and thirsty land, in this situation of need, fleeing from his enemies, he'd remembered God. He turned back to God. He declared, verse 1, O God, thou art my God. And that had satisfied David, just simply to remember God. Oh, in verse 1, David thought he had to seek God, and it would be hard and difficult to find God in such a distant place. But all he had to do was remember God upon his bed, and to meditate on God in the night watches. The watches, the measure of time. Of course, we call a watch today the thing we wear on our wrist to measure the passage of time. In those days, there used to be someone who would watch the stars at night to work out what time it was in the night, and then would blow a musical instrument, a trumpet, an alarm, just in the middle of the night to stir everyone so they would know they were a quarter of the way or a third of the way through the night, and so that if it was necessary to change guards, they could do so. And that was called the watches, because someone had to stay up in the city watching for the time of day, the time of night, of course, when they would blow their trumpet and sound the noise to mark the passing of the watches. There was no one to do that for David, of course, in the wilderness of Judah. For David, he watched the night passing by, and he knew that the watches were being observed, recorded, sounded in the cities. He couldn't hear that, but when he was awake at night, he could meditate on God. He could think about God. He could think about God's goodness. He'd spoken, verse 2, God's power, God's glory, God's sanctuary. Verse 3, God's loving kindness. He thought about these things, and the more he thought about these things, the more, verse 5, his soul was satisfied. And then he could declare in verse 7, because thou hast been my help, therefore in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. God, I might have no one to help me in this world, but you, God, are my helper. God, you're like that mother bird which stretches out her wings over her chicks to keep them safe. And I'm like the little chicks, one of those, underneath your wings, in your shadow, in your protection. Therefore, in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. Oh, I'm going to stay close to God, says David. I love to be under his protection, under the defence of his wings, as it were, and under the defence of a mother bird's wings. I love to be close to God, so I'm going to stay close to God. Verse 8, my soul followeth hard after thee. Hard means close there. I'm following close with God. Where God goes, I'm going to go. Where God leads me, I am going to follow. And I wouldn't be able to do this in my own strength. I'm not so great and so powerful that I can follow after God. I can follow in the ways that God has laid down for me. No, I must depend on God to do it. And so therefore I pray, thy right hand upholdeth me. To uphold means to give someone strength. God, it's you who will strengthen me to do this. It's you who will strengthen me to follow in your ways, to be close to you in prayer, in trusting you, in seeking your power to work in my life and to bring about all that you have promised to do in my life. I am living in safety. I am living in the shadow of God's wings. Verse 7. God himself is my helper. Also verse 7. But what of those evil people who are chasing after me, trying to kill me, in fact trying to destroy my soul, trying to separate me from my God, trying to kill me? What about them? What's going to happen to them if they don't repent, if they don't turn back from this evil way and turn to the living God? Verse 9. But those that seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. Oh, I'm confident in the judgment of God, the judgment that rescues me, but the judgment which, unless these evil people turn from these evil deeds, will bring them into a terrible situation, the lower parts of the earth. David is describing the grave here. He's describing hell here. He's describing they're seeking to destroy me, but they're going to be destroyed in a way that is constant destruction. Oh, how terrible it is to oppose the living God. Verse 10, they shall fall by the sword. In other words, they're going to have a violent death. They're going to have a terrible death. And that terrible death is not an end, because they shall be a portion for foxes. Just as wild animals tear apart dead bodies as they take the meat for food, these evil people, they won't even be properly buried. Or if they are properly buried, then you may be sure the judgment of God against them will not end with their deaths. God will act against them, and against them in power. God doesn't desire the death of a wicked person, it says in Ezekiel, I think chapter 18. No, God desires them to repent, to turn back to him, to escape from these terrible judgments. How important it is to turn back to God, to trust in God. We've seen in this psalm that strange things are happening with time. David began by saying, verse 1, early in the dawn he would seek God. And then we discover in verse 6 that even before the dawn he's remembering God upon his bed, meditating on him in the night watches. And then in verse 1 also, He declared how thirsty his soul and his flesh, his body were. And yet even before he's escaped that wilderness, he's already declaring his soul satisfied, and satisfied with the greatest luxury in verse 5. And in verse 11, something even stranger happens with the timing of this psalm, because David sees himself beyond this situation, beyond this wilderness experience, beyond his troubles. He remembers God's calling on his life. He remembers how God sent the prophet Samuel to anoint him king. David isn't king yet. David won't be king for a few more years. And yet he believes that promise that God made about him. He believes that God will fulfill what he promised, and therefore he describes himself in verse 11 as the king. But the king shall rejoice in God. At the time when wicked people suffer their judgment, then David will be ruling. And David will not be ruling in his own strength. He determines he will not become a wicked person like them. No, he will be a person who rejoices in God. He will find even then his greatest joy in God, not in his wealth, not in his fame, not in the luxury of his palace. No, his joy will remain in God, just as he learnt to place his joy in God in the wilderness, in the desert, so in luxury. And when his situation turns round to one of wealth, he will still rejoice in God. And David declares, everyone that sweareth by him, by God, shall glory. Glory here is not the same Hebrew word as glory in verse 2. In verse 2 it meant the beauty of God, the splendid beauty of God. But in verse 11, totally different Hebrew word, it's declaring rejoicing, boasting in God. Who's going to boast or rejoice in God? Answer, everyone that sweareth by him. To swear means to make a promise. These people are making their promises in the name of God because they, like David in verse 1, have chosen God as their God. Therefore they make promises in his name, and therefore they rejoice in God. Just as Paul could say in the New Testament that he gloried in the cross of Christ, he boasted in what God has done. So everyone who makes their promises in God's name rejoices in their God. But what of the enemies? They get the final mention at the end of this psalm. These are people who live by lies and deceit. They've chased after David. They're trying to kill David so they themselves can benefit from luxury and wealth and importance. But God will act against them. And David declares in confidence, the mouth of them that speak lies shall be stopped. Oh, they will be stopped in their evil deeds. But what is their evil deeds? To speak lies. Therefore their mouth shall be stopped. They will no longer be able to speak those lying words. And God will rescue his servant, David, who will become Israel's king. Please write to me. My email address is 333kjv@gmail.com. My name is Keith Simons. I'd love for you to write to me. Tell me where in the world you are. 333kjv@gmail.com. And now in closing, let me read you the whole of Psalm 63. A psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee, in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen thee in the sanctuary. Because thy loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise thee. Thus will I bless thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in thy name. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise thee with joyful lips, when I remember thee upon my bed, and meditate on thee in the night watches. Because thou hast been my help, therefore in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. My soul followeth hard after thee, thy right hand upholdeth me. But those that seek my soul, to destroy it, shall go into the lower parts of the earth. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be a portion for foxes. But the king shall rejoice in God. Every one that sweareth by him shall glory. But the mouth of him that speak lies, but the mouth of them that speak lies shall be stopped.